os últimos, como ele já está trabalhando com o Global Microbiome, microbioma global. Então, a escala dele é grande, né? Mundial, global. Mas ele está estudando ecologia e alvos moleculares, né? Se tiveram hipermutações. Achei incrível, né? Trabalhar de gases e já trabalhar com os mutantes, hipermutações, na escala de microbioma global. Próximo. Então, o tema dele é ecologia biogeoquímica. E trabalha, então, os temas dele seriam clima, fisiologia vegetal em ecossistemas florestais, ecologia, biogeoquímica em escalas locais e globais, e demografia e processos ecológicos, dinâmica do clima e efeito das atividades humanas em processos biogeoquímicos no funcionamento sustentável do biosfera em geral. E como questão principal do trabalho dele é como a estrutura e a função da vegetação terrestre e das comunidades microbianas regulam os processos biogeoquímicos em larga escala. Finalmente, ele colocou a escala do microbiota. E hoje nós temos essa alegria dele estar publicando numa área que ele pode associar a planta e os processos biogeoquímicos em solo. E ele trabalhou muito na Amazônia, continua trabalhando em projetos, né, integrados junto com o professor Acacio, e na área de Santarém, em Flonas, com o INPA. Então, é algo que a gente tem que trazer, que é muito importante, que ele entende muito essa área tropical e tem contribuído, inclusive, com estudos de gases, desde locais e no ar, né? Então, ele faz em tempo real essas medidas de gases nesses ambientes. Então, eu gostaria, então, de apresentar o professor Scott. So, you can go on now. Thank you for being here with us.
Okay. Well, thank you. Muito obrigado, Tsai, pela generosa introdução. It's been a great pleasure to work with you, Tsai, in my work on the microbial side. But today, I also want to, muito obrigado, Acacio, para me convidar aqui também. Eu lamento não pode estar aí pessoalmente para encontrar todos vocês. So I'm going to today give outra perspectiva no impacto das pesquisas em ecogenômica na gestão sustentável de agroecossistemas. E primeiro, deixe-me começar com pedido de desculpas. Desculpas para meu palestra não sobre ecogenômica e não sobre agroecossistemas, mas sustentabilidade sim. I'm going to address a palestra sobre questão sustentabilidade das florestas em grande escala, sobre mudanças climáticas. Desculpa, eu vou mudar na inglês para agora para a palestra. So let me start. In particular, we're going to look at the grand scale effects at the total on the total basin of the lessons that we're learning from our studies at the small scale, from flux towers like the one shown here and plots that were set in the Amazon forest. And so first, let me acknowledge my co-authors and the great team of collaborators and friends in Brazil that have made this work possible. The top line shows the co-authors of this particular work. And then in red, we have this great team of collaborators that have really made this work possible in Brazil. So I also want to acknowledge the indigenous whose land we still use today in Arizona. Arizona, the state of Arizona is also an indigenous word. And of course, the Amazon basin today is still home to many, many indigenous groups. And it's part of the need to study the sustainability of the system and perhaps learn some lessons that we may have forgotten from their ability to have lived in the Amazon basin for thousands of years. I also want to acknowledge my incredible lab here at the University of Arizona, which, as you can see, is a very international collection, and I continue to learn from them. I want to also acknowledge before the people that I knew way back at the beginning in Brazil, even before I met Tsai. I have to acknowledge, for example, this young woman in the front here who was a student in undergraduate when I first came to Brazil as a young postdoc in 2000, 2001. Now she's a professor at UFOPA. I met here in the slower slide is Rafael Tapajos, who participated as a student in our course, field course in 2010 in Manaus, and now he's a professor at UFOPA. Bernardo Flores is also in this course as a student, and now he's a professor or senior or scientist. And in the upper panel shows my student Neil Prohaska, who's still a student now, and he's working on the tower there. Rodrigo da Silva was a postdoc with me when I came here in 2001 and 2, and now he's a professor at UFOPA. And here in the below one is Deliana Penha, who was the first student to get a PhD from UFOPA, the Universidade Federal Oeste do Pará. And here she's measuring leaves 30 meters above the floor of the forest. So this is an incredible team, and it's been a great opportunity of my life to be working with such people and to be working in such a beautiful place as the forest of the Amazon. And we, of course, are there as professors working hard as usual. Here's an example of the field course in 2009. Myself on the left, my orientador when I was a postdoc, Steve Wafsy at Harvard, and of course, my long-term colleague, Plinio Carmago, colleague also of Tsai at USP in Piracicaba. Okay, so that's enough of the introductions and the acknowledgements of all the people that really are behind some of this work and have enabled me to be here today. Let me now turn to the science of what I want to talk about. And in particular, I want to go back to this title slide and emphasize the question of biogeografia na floresta, or the biogeography of vulnerabilidade e resiliência da floresta, shown by this picture, this map of the whole basin. And this question of biogeography is an old question, and it goes back to, here's an early example from Alexander von Humboldt, who was explorer of ecological questions. And here was a mountain in Ecuador that he studied. And here's a figure that he made that depicted what he called in German Naturgemälde, or which means painting of nature. And it visualized different vegetation zones on the cross section of this Ecuadorian mountain, Mount Chimborazo in Ecuador, and related the vegetation types that changed with altitude and with temperature and with humidity. And this is explained in all the notes on the side of this diagram. But the point for us is that this sort of started a field of study of the distribution of biological species and ecosystems in geographic space. And it links individuals within the web of interconnections that connects them to other things besides the biology, to the abiotic factors across space. And that's what I want to do here with the Amazon forests and their response to drought. And we're going to focus on, therefore, use this idea of biogeography as a problem, not just in scaling, or understanding where species are, which is what it was originally, but also where ecosystem functions are, and how they change in space and time. And in particular, the functions we're going to look at are photosynthesis and vegetation dynamics, and especially in response, how those things respond to drought. And this is building on a line of work that I've done for a long time. So we had some results over 10 years ago. Here's a picture of previous results to a big drought that happened in 2005. And we published this in 2007, which you can see a picture from this 2007 paper. 15 years ago, we published this. Amazon forest green up during the 2005 drought. And on the left-hand figure, you see the drought. In the red areas are the dry areas. And on the right, you see the vegetation response in terms of this thing called EVI, which is shown in the panel. The figure on the left shows the picture of the satellite and the instrument, the MODIS instrument, which is measuring this index, the Enhanced Vegetation Index, or EVI. And this is what we're going to use today to talk about remotely sensed vegetation dynamics, or remotely sensed photosynthesis. And we know that it's pretty good, does a pretty good job of responding to things that matter for photosynthesis. This has been well tested in different biomes across the world. Okay, so this was a very surprising result, going back to this paper, because we usually think of drought as being bad for plants, and instead this showed a green up, a positive response to drought. And this has been reproduced in several other papers that saw it. And the point is, we concluded in this paper that intact Amazon forests may be more resilient than most models assume, at least in response to short-term climate anomalies like this drought. It was a big drought, but it was only a few months. And then just, a few years later came this other paper in Science that was looking not with remote sensing, but with plots on the ground. So the paper on the left was based on these rainfall plots, and the paper on the right was based on remote sensing from satellites. And they found an increase in tree mortality from the 2005 drought. And they concluded in that paper that Amazon forests appear vulnerable to moisture stress like droughts, with the potential for large carbon losses. So this seemed to be the opposite finding. And so one of the questions I want to ask today, coming back, 10 years later, 15 years later, can we reconcile these observations finally? Because this was a source of some debate, and one is right and the other is wrong, or the other way around. Lots of discussion. So, but now I think we have an answer to this puzzle. So I'm going to tell you about it today. So, and we're going to include the fact that there's been two more big droughts since 2005, in 2010 and 2015. And this is exactly the kind of thing that we are expecting under climate change. And so that the models predict that climate change will cause increase in the frequency of droughts in the Amazon. And so we're already seeing this. These are the kind of droughts that typically before only happened every 100 years. And here we saw almost 3 of them in just over 10 years. And this metric that's shown here in the diagram is called the maximum cumulative water deficit. It's a little bit more nuanced than just precipitation. It's a measure of how much of water is actually available at a time. And you can see the red areas are the places where this index is anomalously below the mean. So the number of standard deviations below the mean value. So you can see that there was these extensive droughts in different areas, and especially big in 2015. So we're going to, and here was the response to those droughts in terms of the vegetation response as detected by remote sensing, this EVI anomaly. And you can see in 2005, it repeats the results of the paper that we published 15 years ago. And in the second and third droughts, there's also responses from EVI, but also very different responses. The 2005 drought was positive. We called it green up. In the 2010, there was a very negative response, almost all browning down. And in 2015, which was the most extensive drought, actually had a sort of more intermediate response, with some areas greening up and some areas browning down. So the general question is, why there's these different responses, different times and different places? Why do some areas show this, what might be called resilience, this green up, and other areas are showing vulnerability with either increased mortality or satellite detected brown down? Okay, so that's the question, that's the problem. Let's look at well, we had 3 hypotheses for why we might be seeing these kinds of things beyond climate itself. Obviously, the forest responds to changes in climate, but there are changes in the forest structure, the soils and the environments were what we looked at. And so we came up with these 3 hypotheses that people are talking about. These were from other papers that are published based on ground studies, but we said, let's test these with remote sensing. And the first one was different hydrological environments. The idea here is published recently by a paper led by Flavia Costa just last year, was that that shallow water table areas represent a refuge from drought, and they represent an other side of drought hypothesis in the sense that maybe these areas are actually good, droughts are good in these areas for plants. And so the idea is sort of depicted here in this diagram, where you see a tree that's in the shallow water table forest near the river, and its roots are underwater or in the water, and it may suffer from hypoxia and waterlogging. And if a drought comes along, it lowers the water table and maybe frees the tree roots from hypoxia, and maybe increases or improves the condition of the tree. At the same time, of course, the deep water table trees, the trees over deep water tables, are more deprived than ever of the water resource, and so they may show the opposite response. So that's the first hypothesis I want to look at. We have a couple others that I will come back to later, different soil fertilities and different abilities of trees to tolerate drought. But let's just focus first on this first one, the other side of drought. So here's the map of the 2005 drought response, including all those green areas. And then here below it is a map of water table depths as indicated by this remotely sensed index called HAND. HAND stands for height above nearest drainage. It's not water table depth exactly, but it's an index of that. And this is an idea that was developed by Antonio Nobre, a long-term colleague, and first published in 2011. But here we finally looked at this as a potential indicator of drought response. And if you look at this circle, this ellipse that shows a transition from very green areas in the northeast of that ellipse to the sort of southwest of the ellipse has browner areas. This seems to correspond very well with water table depths. The shallow water tables, the ones in blue, are the areas that greened up. And the deeper water tables, the ones in sort of orange and green, are the ones that brown down. And so we did a systematic analysis of this. And here that shows the analysis in the upper panel. And you can see, so the EVI anomaly, the positive values are the green up, and the negative values are the brown down. And you can see that there's a very strong relationship across all the basin, all the places that were in drought, to water table depth. The shallow water table depth had positive green up, and the deep water table areas had negative. And you see three different colors here that just indicate the drought severity. And surprisingly, even more surprisingly, the strongest drought areas were the ones that had the most positive response. So it's completely the opposite of the expectation. And the distributions here show the distribution of where water tables are deep and where they are shallow. There's a lot more shallow ones than deep ones. And this is actually interesting if you compare it to the blue bars, which are the relative intensity of effort on the ground-based plots, like the rainfall plots. And you can see almost all the effort is in where the blue bars are high, are the places where the most effort is in the ground-based plots. And there's very little effort in the shallowest water tables, which are the most abundant or very abundant in the basin. So this begins to give us an idea of why we saw a different response in these two papers in 2005. If we look a little bit more at the mechanism, here we see water table depth interacting with PAR. PAR is photosynthetically active radiation. It's the amount of sunlight. And so we see along the x-axis is the intensity of sunlight anomaly. More positive values mean more, when there's more drought, there's fewer clouds, there's typically more sunlight. So we see that on average, the increased greenness in terms of the EVI anomaly is in places that had higher amounts of sunlight. But it very much depends on water table depth. The places with the very deep water tables, the orange areas that were resistant, did not green up, were the ones that were deep water tables. The shallow water tables were the ones that were able to take advantage of that extra sunlight and greened up a lot. So we see this very important mechanism in terms of the interaction between sunlight and water table depth. Now, what about the other droughts? This is 2005 drought. This is the drought that had a lot of green up. What about the other droughts? So if we look in the southern Amazon only, here's a picture of the response across all three droughts. The 2005 drought in green shows the green up for shallow water tables. The others, all three show the same other side of drought type response. That is, it's a negative slope. That is, either it's more green up in shallow water tables, or even if it's brown down, it's less brown down than in deep water tables. So we see this consistent support for the idea that shallow water tables are helpful or conducive to drought tolerance. This is actually supported by the ground-based plots that seemed to be contradictory before, but if we look at those by water table depth, we see a consistent response, which is that this is mortality. So it's the opposite effect of on photosynthesis, but we see less mortality in the places that are shallow and more mortality in the places that are deep. So here we see, I think, a reconciliation of the two different responses. The satellite-based response and the plot-based response are shown to be consistent if we look at this factor, the water table depth. But there's still this big difference between the different droughts. Why are these drought responses so different on average, even though they have this negative slope? And if we look at the details of the climate, we can get an answer a little bit to this, which is that 2010, the most negative response, actually had very low sunlight, had a negative response, negative anomaly of sunlight during the drought because there was so much forest fires and so much burning that created aerosols that blocked the sun. So this had both drought and less sunlight. 2015, on the other hand, had very high sunlight, but it also didn't have the highest response. It was sort of this intermediate response that you see in the middle here. But if you look at the drought length, then we might get an idea of this. This figure shows the EVI response as a function of drought length. And we see that we have the strongest positive response for shallow water tables after 3 months. So during the first 3 months, there's a positive response, but after 3 months, it goes down. And we can see the distribution of the different drought lengths for the 3 droughts was longest for 2015. So that was the biggest drought. It had the most positive sunlight anomalies, but also the longest effect, which reduced its ability to withstand or respond positively to drought. Okay, so we have a very nice story coming together here for what I've called the Southern Amazon. So if we go back to the picture of the 3 droughts, we can see I've divided them into 3 different regions. There's the Southern Amazon, which was impacted by all 3 droughts. The blue area is the ever wet Amazon that's always wet, and the reddish boundary is showing the Guyana Shield. And if we look at the ever wet Amazon and the Guyana Shield, especially in 2015, there really isn't the same kind of other side of drought response. The slopes are not negative, they're positive or zero. So we now have a question, why is there a different response in different regions? So now I want to go back to these other 2 hypotheses that I talked about. So we have the other side of drought, the first hypothesis. This explains pretty well, very nicely, some responses in the Southern Amazon. But let's also look at these other regions, or these other hypotheses. First, we have this edaphic or soil fertility hypothesis, which is that you might think that fertility is good for forests. But here, and it is, it makes them grow faster, but if they grow faster, they're going to die sooner also. And it may not make sense for them to invest in making very strong xylem tubes or being very resilient. Because if they die, they can be replaced fairly quickly following a drought, especially if the droughts are rare. So these were 100-year droughts. It might make sense for these not to be super drought resilient if they're in places that have high soil fertility. So we predicted that in high soil fertility areas, there should be poor drought performance of the trees. And this follows on work by Rafael Oliveira that was published just recently in 2021. The third one is the different abilities of trees to tolerate drought. So the idea here is that trees can do things to be better or not so good at drought tolerance. And in particular, they could grow very deep roots. And so tall trees have deeper roots and maybe ability to tolerate drought better and should be expected to have, on average, better drought performance. Okay, so we put these 3 together, or thinking about these 3 together. The first one is the proximity of water to trees. The last one is the proximity of trees to water, because if they grow deep roots, they're closer to the water. And this idea is that soil fertility could mediate both of these. Okay, so let's look at some responses. In particular, we're going to focus on 2015 drought, which had the most extensive impact on all 3 regions at the same time. So analyzing this with a statistical model, we made this general additive statistical model, GAM model, that had both climate. So here it accounts for different levels of PAR, different levels of vapor pressure deficit, different amounts of precipitation and cumulative water deficit, as well as drought length. And then also ecotypes, which include hand, which is water table depth, soil fertility, which was the second hypothesis, and tree height. And what we found is some very interesting results is that it depends a lot on the fertility of trees. The the response to water table depth. So these graphs show the interaction between hand or water table depth on the x-axis, and the vertical axis is the EVI anomaly, but we see a very different response to hand depending on soil fertility. The fertile soils, the ones that are we hypothesized have the most vulnerable trees, show a negative response. This is the classic other side of drought response, but the infertile ones are more drought tolerant, even over deep forests. And if we put this on a two-dimensional map of hand and soil fertility, we can sort of see that this shows hand on the x-axis, soil fertility on the vertical axis, and the color indicates the EVI prediction for average climate conditions. And you can sort of see that the green lines on this graph are the ones taken, that's a slice from the top part of this, which is representing the southern Amazon. The blue lines are taken from a slice across the bottom, which is representing, well, the ever-wet Amazon. And we see these very different responses in these different areas of this map. The other thing that really mattered was tree height. So if we look at tall trees and short trees with presumably shallow roots, again, depended a lot on water table depth or hand. So if the shallow ones did, shallow water table, short trees did better, but if you got to deep water tables, the short trees did not do so well. But tall trees did well, even over deep water tables, the idea being that tall trees have deep roots, which can still access those places. And again, if you sort of make a two-dimensional map of this with tree height now on the vertical axis, so here we've just changed from soil fertility to tree height, and we still have hand, we can see that we've created these very different regions of response depending on what kind of characteristics or what kind of ecotype forests they are. So these ecotypes are really important. They make the models predict better the drought response. So there's a big increase from, if you have climate only, climate explains some of the response. We saw that, excess sunlight is important, but not by itself, it only explains 25%. And we can get almost 10% more increase in variability of the drought response if we add ecotypes too. And the other thing that ecotypes do is really help us understand different mechanisms in different places. So again, we look at these places here. The red circle and the blue circle are in different, or this red area, AP, which stands for Amapá, and this blue area stands for Rio Negro. Those are these same areas here in the 2015 drought, that both of which show green up, but we see from this, they're greening up for very different reasons. The Amapá forests are greening up over deep water tables because they have tall trees, but the Rio Negro forests, even though they are short, are greening up because they have shallow water tables. So this analysis has been very powerful for helping us understand different mechanisms for causing what appears to be the same response. And it's important to understand that these responses, which look the same when they have different mechanisms, can be very important. So then we tested these predictions with observations. And so this just shows that if you divide the three regions of the Amazon, you can predict well with this model, this GAM model, which is the shaded areas. The shaded areas are well predicting the points, which are the observations. And in the blue area, which is the ever wet, this only has shallow water table forest, so it doesn't come to deeper than 20. But in any case, you can see that there's different responses. The southern Amazon has this classic other side of drought hypothesis response of a negative slope, meaning shallow water tables do better, deep water tables do less well. And we have different responses in the different regions because they have different ecotypes, different amounts of trees that are in fertile areas or have deep roots. Okay, so to wrap this all up, let me just show, this has allowed us to create what we call a biogeography of Amazon forest resilience and vulnerability. So here's a picture of the biogeography of forest resilience and vulnerability. The green areas are resilient. That is, those are places that tend to green up. But we've subtracted the climate from the GAM, and now just depicting the tendency of the response based on the biogeography of those ecotypes, fertility and tree height, and water table depth. So we see that this is the red areas are forests that tend to be vulnerable, and the green areas are forests that tend to be resilient. And if we look at the type, we can map this to the reasons, the mechanisms why they're resilient or vulnerable. And here, what this map on the right shows is these three different factors: infertile soil, shallow water table depths, or tall trees. Each of these factors are thought to be conducive to resilience. So if all those factors are absent, we have white areas. And you can see these white areas down here and up here correspond to red or vulnerable forests on the left. And that these different colors show the combination. So orange is the combination of tall trees and infertile soils, and green is the combination of shallow water table depths and infertile soils, and brown is all three together, et cetera. And you can sort of see this map is a map of factors that contribute to resilience. So if we put all these then we can sort of look at the distribution of these, and that's what this graph does. This shows the most vulnerable forests on the left, most vulnerable ecotypes on the left, the most resilient ecotypes on the right, and you can see that they represent a certain fraction. So the fraction of vulnerable forests in the white areas, the ones which have no protective ecotypes, is very high. The fraction of vulnerable forests in the most protected areas is low. And so we have this very nice quantification of the fraction of forests that are vulnerable and resilient according to their biogeography of ecotypes. So this is, I think, a very insightful finding. It really helps us understand what's going on in drought response and why different areas might be more vulnerable than others. So in summary, hydraulic environments first are important for scaling drought response. There is indeed an other side of drought, a side of drought where droughts are either good for forests or which forests can do well. And these are shallow water table forests. And they persist or increase their function during drought in contrast to deep water table forests. But it's a little more complicated if you look across the basin. That depends on a few other things. It depends on fertility and tree height that also matter. Water table depth sensitivity depends on fertility. So in fertile areas, which support fast-growing trees, but those trees are also drought vulnerable, those are the ones that benefit most from shallow water tables. And lower fertility areas are less affected by water table depth because they're already resilient. When you're in low fertility areas, you grow trees slowly, you make sure they're well protected, that they can deal with droughts. Secondly, it also depended on tree height. The tallest and deepest rooted trees enabled green up behavior, even in regions that had mostly deep water table forests. So that sort of, but there's also a warning here, which is, this first thing, this variation in hydrologic environments and these other ecotypes likely means that on average, Amazon forests are more resilient than some models assume, because models don't take account of things like water table depth. And as we saw before, the distribution of plots, rainfall plots, is biased towards deep water table forests, which are more vulnerable. So if we just look at the average response of the observations of forest plots, we'll get a biased picture of what the Amazon is like, because something like a third of the Amazon is in shallow water table areas. But there's also a warning here. This is not all good news. Climate change is undermining several different important strategies of forest resilience. Long droughts, as we saw in 2015, undermine resilience even in places that have shallow water tables. And this idea that infertile forests are drought tolerant because they build tougher trees is fine, but the more frequent droughts, they'll undermine the fertile forest strategy. So fertile forest is the idea that they'll grow trees fast and cheap, but if they happen every 100 years to kill trees, then they can grow them back, no problem. But if these start happening every 10 years, that's going to be, that strategy will no longer work very well. So finally, our next step is that because current models do not capture drought dynamics very well, they don't represent these kinds of heterogeneities that we talked about today in models. So this provides a strategy and a basis for improving models by incorporating this biogeography of ecotypes into those models to look at forest drought response. So finally, to come back to the beginning, switching back to Portuguese, para voltar para onde começamos, outra perspectiva da sustentabilidade. The question of sustainability is that we are learning a lot from thinking about the biogeografia de ecotipos, and nós entendamos sustentabilidade das florestas mais bem. E exemplo está para melhorar as prioridades da conservação. So we might be able to think better about what forests to focus conservation efforts on if we know which ones are going to be vulnerable and which ones resilient to climate change. Okay, that's the end of my story. I just want to make sure I acknowledge our funding sources and our various institutions that have been involved with this work, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Muito obrigado. And I know it's late in the day there, so you might want to finish up so you can go to dinner. So where are we now? Hi, Tsai.
I will make one comment about it, then we'll go first to some questions from the audience. Is possible for you?
Yes, of course.
Well, I think you have this idea of the what you call brown down. This is at falling down the trees, no? This spleen is going to take the samples, 3 kilometers square meters. One example of this, is this that your work with him?
I didn't quite hear at the beginning.
About the brown down is a kind
Yes.
of, I think this is very strategic way of understanding. First, as a global way of biogeography, then go to the local. Are you going to the local then?
Yes,
study each one?
so we're studying this in particularly in the Tapajós region.
Tapajós. But you have some IAPA also in Manaus.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's.
Yeah, Arizona. Let me summarize to them, okay?
Sure. Yes, please.
Eu
Obrigado.
acho muito interessante o que ele está trazendo, porque existem áreas de queda de árvores de 3 quilômetros quadrados. E isso em estações que tem um vento e derruba todas as árvores, faz clareira. Então, isso ele está procurando descobrir através de estudos de drone, usando fertilidade. O grupo dele é um pouco mais de geofísico, mas tem outro grupo do Jos Barlow, estuda para lá, mas ele estuda também nutrição. Eu acho que a gente trabalhar nutrição de florestas na Amazônia é uma forma de entender a sustentabilidade da floresta. Mas eu acho que ele está trazendo uma informação muito nova com as hipóteses dele, de associar com acesso à água, porque se alguém for na Amazônia, se pisar, é muito raso. E tudo isso depende muito da serrapilheira, do nutriente, mas qualquer vento forte, ele consegue. Agora ele está vendo que ecótipos também pode. Então, a turma da ecologia pode ajudar, né? Da fisiologia vegetal, porque ele associou fisiologia vegetal. E qual a planta que cresce mais rápido, mais barata, né? É o que está acontecendo nos ecótonos, né? Será que vai transformar em ecótono? Porque o Cerrado e Mata Atlântica também está tendo ecótono. Is it possible to have some variation ecotypes, changing trees for cheap trees, fast growing? And so this can change some of these regions after for conservation. The fast trees will grow faster, the cheap trees will grow faster. Is that your idea?
Yes. See. We are often doing interactions of looking at remote sensing and then looking at local sites to understand these responses at the local level, either using the towers or you refer to Joss Barlow and Erica Behringer, who have plots across these areas too, which are looking much more extensively.
But your way of understanding is also very valuable. So I'm very glad that you bring all this idea of a hypothesis. It's nice, and then you can go locally, não? Study
Yes.
locally.
Yeah.
Porque daí ele vai trabalhar mais locais. Depois que ele vê esse panorama, ele pode colocar, ir para frente e buscar essas hipóteses dele. Mas essa de substituir plantas que crescem mais rápido, aí naturalmente, eu acho que é um risco também, não, gente? Mas agora, Amazonas que nunca pega fogo. Dá para dizer isso também? Não, né? Mas é verdade que cai. Então, na verdade, não é nem cai a floresta. Então, você quer fazer uma pergunta? Eiko, Kuramai from Neil, she want to ask you.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Eiko Kuramai from the Netherlands Institute of Ecology.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My name is Eiko Kuramai. I'm from the Netherlands. I have a question, maybe a discussion with you. When you talk about soil fertility in the Amazon, in fact, we are talking about the above ground biodiversity, right? Because this is what's the plants that are, the litter is degraded and then increase all this cycle, above ground, below ground interaction. And who is doing this? I cannot leave the microbes out because I'm microbiologist, but who is doing all these processes in the soil are the microbes, right? So you had three hypotheses to explain this pattern that you observed, this drought. I want to challenge you a fourth one. What about the soil structure? Because if you think about the soil fertility, in fact, is as I said, the above ground, below ground interaction, but there is activity of the microbes in the soil. So they may play a role in the structure and also in to serve some services to keep the soil more tolerant to the drought. And then by doing so, they also change the structure of the soil. I know that you did this study in a large scale. You didn't go locally to test the hypothesis, but this is something that I would like to add to hear your opinion.
So the question was about soil structure. You mean like parent material or physical?
No, physical structure, because for instance, aggregates because this is done by microbes, right?
Like clay versus sand and things like this.
Or the increase of the structure in long term because of the microbes, because of the recycling of the above ground, because of the above ground biomass.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that's important, and we didn't include many things. We were partly limited by, in this kind of analysis where we're looking at the whole basin, we can only use those things that are represented with a spatially explicit map. So some things we know from local studies that matter, like I think soil structure and probably microbial communities probably affect a lot the dynamics of vegetation that grows in them from the recycling of material that the microbes do. But we don't have any maps of the types of microbes at the basin scale. I mean, we have individual plots, but we do have we use the things that we have maps for, and that leaves a lot of room for improvement, I think. And as I said, this model that we came up with that combined climate and ecotypes, this statistical model, explained about 35 or 40% of the variance. So there's still a lot of room to the other 60 or 65%. So I think you're exactly right, and that's a good next step to think about. Either looking at this, you are probably looking at this at the local scale, and then as we develop spatially explicit models that we can relate at the larger scale, then we'll be able to, incorporate these too.
Ok, thank you. Vocês querem que eu traduza? Eu perguntei para ele que a gente sabe que na Amazônia, o solo da Amazônia não é fértil. É fértil porque se desmatar não é fértil. É fértil porque tem a above ground, tem a vegetação. Então, eu perguntei para ele assim, quem faz essa reciclagem do nutriente são os micro-organismos do solo, certo? E ele citou 3 hipóteses que estariam acontecendo, esse padrão que ele observou nos mapas. Aí eu perguntei se ele não considera, eu consideraria uma outra hipótese que seria também, que poderia juntar, que explicaria, seria a estrutura do solo. Porque quem faz a estrutura do solo, quem ajuda a estruturar o solo, são os micro-organismos que fazem essa decomposição, essa reciclagem. Ele falou que é uma coisa para considerar, porque a explicação que ele mostrou lá, a explicação é só de 37%, 35% do que ele mediu. Ainda tem umas 65%, 70% aí para achar o que pode explicar, né, esse 65% que está faltando. Mais ou menos isso.
Alô? Ok.
Hello.
Hi, Scott.
Hi.
Sorry, I don't speak English. I ask in Portuguese.
Oh, no problem. That's okay. I should speak better Portuguese.
Ok. Você mostrou muito bem aí algumas hipóteses, né, da resiliência da floresta amazônica, combinando o tipo de vegetação, né, a altura de plantas, com a profundidade do nível de saturação de água, combinada com a fertilidade do solo. A minha pergunta é, vocês chegaram a pesquisar alguma coisa de como as áreas de pastagem, a proximidade das áreas de pastagem com a floresta amazônica pode afetar essa resiliência? Can be translated?
What is the effect of pastures on resilience? Was that the question?
And the observation you had in your studies.
Yes. So what I showed you today. So you're talking about pastures or converted areas, right? Was that the question?
Sorry.
Just to make sure I understood, he was asking
his question is about if you have observed some region with pasture and how this region would influence your observations or your measurements.
Great, got it. Thank you. So what I presented today focused on the places that did not have pasture or were intact forests. But we've looked at this question to some extent. And, for example, the pasture area, in terms of what is growing there, I mean, it's not the same thing usually, but it's not trees, but it's showing much more vulnerability, at least to dry seasons and drought. And we think that's just because by cutting down trees, you've cut down the access to deep water tables or deeper water tables usually. And so we see places, we've seen this specifically with regard to the seasonality of forests. So seasonality of ecosystems. So places that in the central Amazon, there's a tendency for forests to increase. I talked today about drought, but you can look at this for the average typical annual dry season. Every year most places in the Amazon have a dry season. Seasonalidade de seca. Na seasonalidade de seca, florestas fica mais verde, mas pastagens oposto, fica mais now verde. So I think this is showing that these areas they diminish the resilience when you change to pasture.
Não, ele falou assim que ele já olhou para essas áreas com pastagem, mas nesse estudo, pelo que entendi, não. Mas também é dependente da sazonalidade, porque quando é seca, lá na Amazônia, na época seca, as plantas são mais verdes, mas as regiões que não são, de passagem são menos verdes, né, que são mais secas. Mas isso pode interferir, sim, na resiliência.
I have one last question. Are you going to select which region to study more deeply? I'm challenging you too.
Yeah, that's a good question. We should go back to that forest, that diagram of forest biogeography, and make sure that we study places that are neglected but are important. So one area that fits that already, and we're already working on this, especially around Manaus, and colleagues like my former student Scott Stark and colleague Flavia Costa, looking at shallow water tables, which, like I said and showed, that the rainfall plots tend to neglect these areas. So it's important to study the neglected areas that this analysis shows may be important to understand. I think the other thing, so that's one thing, is shallow water tables, shallow water table forests in the valleys, near the rivers. People tend to put the plots, they go to a place and they want a nice plot on a flat area that's away from complicating factors like rivers. And so that tends to bias you, I think. But I think the other thing is to look at this effect of fertility and the sort of almost sort of people I think counterintuitive to some extent anyway. Fertility, you might think, is an aid to drought response, but it's also it makes for an easier life, and so trees don't have to work so hard to in some sense, and so the trees are are used to an easy life in the fertile forest, and so therefore they're more vulnerable to drought. Is sort of the idea, and I think it would be interesting to study that. That's sort of our inference from the satellite, but it's also some evidence on the ground that I think would be worth looking at some more. And of course, there's also interactions between the fertility and the water table depth.
So I would say that this is a very nice proposal, because Beto Quezada?
Oh yes, of course.
That is the nutritional studies on nitrogen fertilization.
Yes, and phosphorus. They had the science paper on phosphorus just a few months ago.
Existe grupo do INPA trabalhando com nitrogênio e fósforo, com doses já em floresta. Então, estão buscando já ver a fertilidade junto com os grupos. Então, acho que o grupo do INPA também já está preocupado com isso.
Well, that's one thing, actually, you remind me, Tsai, of one other important thing is, I don't know if I said this explicitly, but the fertility that we looked at was exchangeable base cations. And the reason we looked at that is there's a map, a basin-wide map of base cations that actually came out of Beto Quesada's group a few years ago. Gabriela Zucchim was the first author. But there is no map like that for phosphorus. And phosphorus is generally recognized as a really important nutrient in old weathered soils, like most of the Amazon has. So, these base cations are to some degree correlated with phosphorus, but not completely. And we'd like to be able to do this analysis with phosphorus, not just base cations.
But you can give us the indication the where to go. There's one last question for you. Oh, that's okay. I can finish. It's okay for you now. We are very glad that you could be with us at this final time, at this colloquium, the impact on the ecogenomics research, the sustainability of the agrosystems. So
without ecosystems and without ecogenomics and without agroecosystems.
But you will go in the future.
Yes,
I think so. You're just moving to this. So, Scott, I want to thank you so much for being here with us, and we are here attending.
Thank you for
everybody wants to say thank you too. Okay.
Muito obrigado.
Acacio want to talk to you.
Para a comida. Acacio, great.
Hi, Scott. Thank you so much for your talk. Very nice talk about the Amazon, and thanks so much also for the close lecture from our colloquium. I hope met you at Santarém.
I hope, yes, we will.
Thank
Obrigado,
you.
Acacio. Obrigado, Tsai. Muito obrigado para a convida. Próxima vez, junto pessoalmente, eu espero.
Okay, see you.
Tchau.
Tchau.
O professor Dr. Acacio Aparecido Navarrete, que fará as considerações finais do colóquio.
Bom, dizer então que ao longo deste dia, né, ao longo deste sábado, nós tivemos oportunidade, assim como uma águia que vê de cima macro, começarmos nossas discussões e depois nos aprofundarmos para uma visão mais especializada, mais específica e entendermos o micro. Foi uma discussão bastante profícua que passou ao longo dos dias também do CONCISUS, pelas questões políticas, de desenvolvimento, né, de saúde, até que chegássemos aqui nessas questões moleculares que dão subsídio para práticas mais sustentáveis, gestões, né, destes agroecossistemas sob uma ótica mais sustentável. Então, a proposta do colóquio como evento paralelo ao CONCISUS era trazer a possibilidade de uma reflexão com base em um nível hierárquico de organização da vida, que é o molecular, dando subsídio para que nós compreendêssemos níveis tróficos, níveis hierárquicos de organização da vida muito mais complexos, como as comunidades, os ecossistemas e a biosfera. Acredito que com as excelentes palestras, mesas e discussões que foram aqui suscitadas, nós atingimos esse objetivo. Então, as considerações finais são essas, positivas, alegres, após um dia de intensas discussões e excelentes palestras.
Nós vamos encerrar esse evento, dando a palavra inicialmente ao professor Dr. Luiz Sergio Vanzela, coordenador do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Ciências Ambientais da Universidade Brasil. Em seguida, para a professora mestre Silvana, Márcia, Ximenes, Mininel, coordenadora pedagógica da Universidade Brasil, campus Fernandópolis.
Bom, boa noite já, né? Os guerreiros ficaram até o final, mas assim, minhas palavras não são tão bonitas igual a do Acacio, né? O Acacio sempre tem uma visão, a mente dele pensa muito mais bonito do que eu, né? Então, mas eu vou dizer o seguinte, eu acho que eu estou muito feliz, né, como presidente do CONCISUS, aqui do quarto CONCISUS, ver que essa quarta edição, já com o Acacio bem mais integrado no grupo efetivamente, né, Acacio? Nos trouxe realmente um ganho assim, espetacular nesse evento, né? Então, primeira vez que esse evento já ganha essa distância geográfica a mais, né? Trazendo pesquisadores importantes, né? E discutindo assuntos bem interessantes em termos de resiliência climática, que é a preocupação principal aqui do evento, né? Embora um evento que pensa regional, mas ele tem realmente um fundamento de avançar mais aí em outras direções geográficas. Para os nossos alunos da pós-graduação e para os profissionais aqui de Fernandópolis e região, acho que foi uma experiência que não tem nem palavras, né? Ver os nossos alunos apresentando o trabalho, interagindo com os pesquisadores aqui do Brasil e de outros países, foi bem interessante. Então, assim, realmente agradecer você, Acacio, por realmente tomar bastante à frente, né, desse evento, chacoalhar a gente para a gente conseguir recurso FAPESP, CAPES, né, para conseguir trazer esses pesquisadores aqui. Também aos professores, aos demais professores do nosso programa de pós-graduação, que eles, vamos usar o termo vulgar, né, pau para toda obra, tá? Então, sempre que a gente requisita, pode ser qualquer dia, horário, eles trabalham firme para desenvolver pesquisa numa região que, como foi dito aqui pelo Sergio, né, não tem muita essa cultura, né, de pesquisa, mas nós estamos aqui, a Universidade Brasil, pelo programa de pós-graduação, tentando, né, desenvolver a pesquisa. Agradecer também a equipe nossa de apoio aí, a Elise, a Gabriela, e todos os meninos aí do professor Kleber, né, os voluntários que vêm aqui. Sem vocês isso aqui seria impossível, né? Porque nós somos mais velhos, eu não sei ficar mexendo nessas tecnologias de transmissão, né? Essas coisas aí é só essa moçada mais nova. Então, sem eles, realmente, isso aqui não funcionaria. E também ao público em geral, né? Os nossos alunos, aos alunos que vêm de fora, aos demais profissionais. Afinal, esse congresso são formados de pessoas, né? Então, as pessoas estão aqui se congregando, sem elas realmente não existe nada disso. Então, não adianta eu ter recursos, pesquisadores que vêm de fora, sendo que não tem o público, né? Eu acho que isso é o principal. Então, agradeço a todos vocês que vieram e participaram todos esses dias aqui e contribuíram também com o nosso congresso. Não posso deixar de agradecer também a nossa universidade, né? Aqui, então, em nome da professora Silvana, que sempre nos apoia, né, Silvana? Silvana, amiga de longa data aqui em Fernandópolis, a prefeitura também de Fernandópolis, né, que apoia bastante. Eu sou secretário de Meio Ambiente, o prefeito sempre apoia nossas iniciativas. Eu acho que aqui em Fernandópolis, se existe um local em que a academia, a pesquisa anda junto com a gestão pública, né, acho que aqui é um exemplo, e nós tivemos nesses últimos anos um grande ganho ambiental, em gestão ambiental aqui no município. Tá? Então, agradecer também ao prefeito, né, que nos apoiou com esse belo local aqui, né, para fazer o evento, e agradecer a universidade aí, em nome da Silvana. Depois eu peço que você repasse para nossa mantenedora, né, a Bárbara, tá? Mas é isso, pessoal. Então, realmente agradecer a todos vocês aí o empenho, tanto do público quanto das equipes aí todas em promover esse evento. Ok?
Bom, pessoal, em nome da Universidade Brasil, né, qual estou representando, agradeço a todos, né, ao Vanzela, a toda a sua equipe, a todos os professores aqui da pós-graduação, né, o Acacio, que me para no corredor, né, o Vanzela a todo momento, mas que nós formamos aqui junto com a pós-graduação da Universidade Brasil uma grande equipe, né, e a pesquisa é uma semente, né, que nós estamos plantando a todos os dias, e né, agradecer esse congresso, né, que agradecer e destacar a importância, né, dos grandes pesquisadores em todas as palestras, né, agradecer todo o grupo que organizou, que está aqui os 3 dias, não é muito, né, fácil, né, Vanzela? Mas é uma semente que nós vamos plantando a cada dia. E nós da Universidade Brasil, só estamos aqui a agradecer a todos, ao Roberto, em nome de todos aí da equipe. E queria agradecer muito e que a Universidade Brasil já está esperando o próximo. Tá bom? Boa noite a todos, é um agradecimento imenso.
Então, beleza. Então, é com grande honra, né, vamos dizer assim, pelo fechamento com chave de ouro que nós tivemos aqui, que eu encerro oficialmente o 4º CONCISUS, né? E eu desejo a todos aí um bom resto de sábado, um ótimo domingo. Para quem tem que viajar, né? Que viajem muito bem aí, tá ok? Então encerramos o 4º CONCISUS oficialmente agora.